let's take shale oil. The U.S. went from importing 60% of its oil to being energy independent because of shale. So I was looking at the numbers. The U.S. was spending, let me go back to 2008, something like $400 billion a year on its import bill. Now that bill is down 99%. And the same thing with LNG. I mean, this is accruing a lot of economic benefits to the United States that run through the economic system, which kind of just gets left out of the discussion.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management.
Welcome back to the Future of Energy on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Daniel Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global and author of the best-selling book, The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, as well as the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Prize. We'll be discussing the return of energy security and how energy is reshaping geopolitics and the new map of the future of energy. Hello, Dan. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Well, thank you, David. I'm glad to be on, and it's a good topic, the future of energy.
Yeah, it's so good to have you back and to have you back for this series. I can't think of anyone with whom I'd rather talk about the future of energy. And I know a little earlier this year, you published a report that you called The Return of Energy Security, in which you argued that the pendulum had swung from a focus on climate and decarbonizing our energy system to a focus on energy security, making sure energy was affordable and reliable. And I'm curious how you see this dynamic playing out over time. Do you think the pendulum will continue to swing back and forth between these two competing concerns?
Well, I think what had happened is that climate just entirely took over the discussion, and energy security kind of just left the room, and it was during COVID, prices collapsed, demand plummeted. And so, people just took supply for granted. But then came the Ukraine war and disruptions of markets. And I think that's what, as a prominent Japanese said, it was a real wake-up call. And actually, it was even on the coming back before then, because the Biden administration did its first release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve 4 months before the Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think now you look at actions as well as rhetoric, and you see that energy security is part of the equation. And if you don't have that, energy transition becomes more difficult, and you get a political backlash, by the way, as well as real economic problems. So I think, leaders now really need to think about energy security as well in a way that they didn't for a few years.
In terms of where they're at now, do you feel like we're at kind of a good point in terms of balancing this discussion between security and decarbonizing? Or do you think we still need to make an adjustment one way or the other?
I think we have to, prices go down, and it's important not to forget it. But also energy security, if you're a developing country, energy security is something you live with every single day. I mean, it's remarkable to think that 3 billion people in the world today use less electricity annually than an average size American refrigerator. I mean, so there are different perspectives depending where you are. But if you look at policies that even Germany and others are doing, you can see that energy security is now part of the equation, even if they don't give it the same rhetorical attention.
Oh, can you give an example of that?
Well, Germany is committing $17 billion to build natural gas-fired electric generation quietly to balance out its renewables, and that's so that they don't have disruptions in their electricity supply. I think that's an example. I think we saw over the last few years, the Biden administration, even while criticizing the oil industry, also saying to it, oh, by the way, could you produce more supplies so we don't have shortages?
Yeah, and I know the Biden administration received a lot of attention for the moratorium, so to speak, on LNG export approvals, future approvals. How did you think about that episode? How did you put that in context?
Well, I think, I guess like everything, of course, there's a political context to it. There's some of the parts of the environmental world are critical of LNG and the buildup of LNG. I think you have to look at it in overall context. The U.S. went from nowhere in 2016 to being the world's largest exporter of LNG today. Europe, the coalition supporting Ukraine, probably would have collapsed after Russia cut off the gas were it not for LNG, 40% of which came from liquefied natural gas came from the United States. So, and we're going to add a lot of capacity, but still it adds a lot of uncertainty. At our CERAWeek conference this year, the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, said by, March of next year, it will be in the rearview mirror. And I think there's, uncertainty whether this pause is a pause or it's the preamble to a longer term cap on growth. It certainly caused a lot of uncertainty in people who are making billion-dollar type financial commitments, and very upsetting to the Europeans and deeply worrying to the Japanese, who depend on LNG as their baseload for electric generation, and see the growth of U.S. shale and the LNG that results from that as part of their energy security. So, when the Prime Minister of Japan was here in Washington a month or two ago, certainly the Japanese were expressing a lot of concern about this. So I don't think we'll know until after, if I can pick a date, November 5th.
Interesting date. Yeah, I know when the pause occurred, it made me think back to the last time you were on the podcast with us, and you were talking about how permitting is such a challenge. Permitting is such an obstacle to getting the investment we need to make sure that energy supplies stay secure. And I'm curious, how much of this is simple effects of bureaucracy, or how much is a strategy that, people who don't want to see more oil and gas develop, more oil and gas used, are using the permitting process as a way to keep that from happening?
Well, I think permitting is an endemic problem across the energy spectrum, from natural gas pipelines to transmission lines. We're seeing now more opposition, local opposition to wind deployment. So every aspect of building anything is a challenge. Certainly, there's concern about minerals that you need for the energy transition. Can you get a mine permit in the United States? So some of it is just bureaucracy, is the machinery of government, and that you might have 5 or 6 different government agencies involved. The other part of it is, of course, it is a strategy of opponents of projects to do it and to go through the permitting challenges one after another. And then on top of that, the judicial challenges that follow the granting of a permit. So, it's an endemic feature of our political system that this occurs. There's an effort in the revising the National Environmental Protection Act that goes back to 1970, I believe is the year, which would facilitate renewable development, according to the administration, but might make it even tougher for conventional energy projects. And yet, you look at electricity demand, you're going to have to build a lot of things that aren't in place now.
Right. And I wanted to go back for a second, because you mentioned earlier in the conversation that part of that pendulum swinging to like an almost exclusive focus on decarbonization and climate at the expense of security was around the COVID pandemic period, loss of demand and plentiful supply. And then in the report you put out earlier this year, you noted that at the end of this year, at the end of 2024, demand for oil will be 3 million barrels a day higher than before the pandemic in 2019. So I'm curious, how much of a head fake was the COVID pandemic loss of demand? And what are your thoughts on when or if we'll reach peak oil demand?
Well, I'd say, plus or minus 3 million barrels a day. Demand is a little weaker now because of the persistence of high interest rates, and that the recovery in China has not been as strong as had been anticipated. That said, it certainly will be, those few million barrels a day higher. I think COVID, the social effects linger. I mean, just look at work patterns, how life has been transformed by Zoom. I think we'll see the delayed reaction in terms of commercial real estate as renewals of leases and so forth come due, and everybody's, businesses generally reducing their footprint. So I think there are a number of different impacts. And certainly I think it led to use your term, a head fake, just saying, oh, the energy problems are over and we just have a straight line from here to there. And your question about peak oil, that's been such a persistent question. I still think when you look at growth in the developing world, when you look at another 2 billion people by 2050, I think it's a reasonable expectation that oil demand continues to increase until the early 2030s. But it doesn't, by the way, collapse. It just starts to get on a declining plateau. Obviously, a lot depends upon the speed at which electric vehicles come in on the one side, but economic growth on the other, particularly in the developing world.
Yeah, and with the developing world, I feel like people are beginning to put a little bit more attention to the importance of demand and energy security for people in the developing world as we think about what an energy transition might look like. And you've certainly been one to highlight this and shine a light on it. And I'm curious, in your conversations, where do you think we are in terms of policymakers and others? And do we need to get the energy security of the developing world closer to the top of the list during any discussion of an energy transition?
Well, I think that's the reality. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the new map is this emergence of a new north-south divide where there are different priorities in a developing country than a developed country. Germany has a per capita income of $60,000 a year, depending on how you measure it. Senegal, $4,000. In Senegal, they think about energy differently. For them, it's still women gathering wood and indoor air pollution. So it is a different agenda. We did, since I've been with you last, we did a conference called Energy Asia in Kuala Lumpur. And it was just striking for me to listen to perspectives from Asians, from developing countries, that are not what you would hear in Western Europe in an energy climate discussion. And it was about the importance of energy for economic growth.
Was there any of those things that were said that has really stuck with you that you could share with us?
Well, I think that one was actually another circumstance where I was chairing a session of African energy ministers. And the minister from Senegal was saying they need to build a natural gas pipeline so women stop gathering wood for job creation and to reduce indoor air pollution, which is quite deadly. And she said the European banks, because of rules in Europe, wouldn't finance them, wouldn't provide financing. And she said, not having that finance was like taking the ladder away. And her words really stuck in my mind. She said, what do they expect us to do? Jump or fly? How do we handle this? And I think, that really captured a lot for me, that, just the perspective of a developing country is very different than a rich country that relatively is has a well built up diverse energy infrastructure system.
Yeah, and energy security is a day-to-day reality for many people, or the energy insecurity is a day-to-day reality for many people in the developing world. Yeah, I think for those of us in the US and Europe, probably the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the European energy crisis really put it back on the map. It's interesting at that period, as you said, LNG offset half of Europe's shortfall in natural gas supplies during that crisis. And half of that LNG came from the United States, which, as you said, in 2016 wasn't even on the map in terms of exports.
Well, and just let me say that when people were developing the U.S. LNG business, they assumed that Asia was the market. Now, talk about impact of COVID, because China was still shut down. Supplies that were supposedly going to go to China could relatively easily, although at higher costs, be diverted to Europe. In fact, some Chinese companies which had contracted for U.S. LNG then pivoted and sent that LNG to Europe. And so, if China had been going full throttle, what was a bad situation would have been even worse. But LNG was, turned out to be a global market for gas.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned your book, The New Map, and thinking about, how shale and U.S. production, now the U.S. is one of the largest exporters of LNG.
Actually, David, right now the largest, although Qatar intends to recover that crown, but right now the U.S. is still unbelievably in the number one position.
And how has that changed the terms of global geopolitics and power with the U.S. being so important in energy now?
Well, that was one of the themes I really wanted to explore in the new map. And I think the answer is that it has given the U.S. a new element of influence in the world. I've worked with India's, I've been on this energy think tank for the Indian government, and the ability to import oil and gas from the United States has been one significant part of an improved relationship between the U.S. and India. I think the most important example actually is Europe. Putin, he thought he could use the energy weapon, in this case, gas, not oil. He thought Europe was so dependent that he could shut the valve and that Europe, that coalition, would shatter under the economic pressure and turmoil that would come forward. And I have a story in the new map about, now this is a decade ago, called it in the old days when relations were not where they are today, obviously. And I was at this thing called the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And Putin was on the stage with then Chancellor Merkel of Germany. And they said to me, "Oh, why don't you ask the first question?" So I started to ask him the obvious question. Isn't your budget way over dependent on oil and gas revenues? And I mentioned shale, and he interrupted and started shouting at me and saying, shale is barbaric, it's terrible, it's awful, it will poison people. And this is in front of 3,000 people, so it was not a comfortable experience to be shouted at by Putin. But I would say that he was prescient. He saw that U.S. shale and that shale gas in general would compete with gas from Gazprom, his Russian giant company, and that it would augment U.S. influence in the world. And I think the events a decade later with the invasion of Ukraine and the response of the global gas market led by the U.S. demonstrated that Putin was right to see that shale threatened the hegemony of Russian gas in Europe. And so I think that's the most traumatic example. And it's an example we're living with today and that is crucial in this battle that continues to unfold.
And what role do you see natural gas and LNG playing in the future of our global energy system looking out on the longer horizon?
I think that one of the main things LNG will do is supplant coal in Southeast Asia and developing countries, which actually will reduce emissions. So I think LNG is going to be a growth business. I'm sure a country like Qatar was delighted to see the pause on LNG development in the United States because they're going gung-ho to build up their position, and other suppliers are coming to the market. I saw just the other day, the CEO of one of the companies, international companies, said if the U.S. isn't careful, it will lose the competitive momentum that it has right now. Let's take shale oil. The U.S. went from importing 60% of its oil to being energy independent because of shale. So I was looking at the numbers. The U.S. was spending, let me go back to 2008, something like $400 billion a year on its import bill. Now that bill is down 99%. And the same thing with LNG. I mean, this is accruing a lot of economic benefits to the United States that run through the economic system, which kind of just gets left out of the discussion.
Yeah, it certainly does. It seems to get left out of the discussion as long as people know that it's available when they need it, and we don't pay attention to when it's not. I also wanted to get your thoughts. The energy transition to an electrified system powered by low-carbon renewables like solar and wind is dependent on critical minerals and metals like copper, nickel, lithium, and many of these are produced in a relatively small set of countries and processed in China. And given your experience in the oil markets in the past decades, I'm curious what lessons from the past should we learn for the future about the consequences of having, our energy system depending on a small number of producers?
It's very interesting because you talk about that. 3 countries produce about 40% of the oil, U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia. 2 countries produce 40% of copper, Chile and Peru. And I think Peru has gone through about 7 presidents in the last few years. So I think there is a precariousness, particularly, the energy transition, a lot of it is about electrification, and copper is the metal of electrification. We looked at it, spent 8 months on a study looking at it, and concluded that in order to meet the kind of 2050 goals that are out there, copper has to double by 2035. David, it takes 20 years to develop a tier one mine. So there is a constraint there. And then you point to the second element of it, which is how much of that is concentrated through China, particularly not mining, but even more so in terms of processing. We have a trade war with China now on everything from chips to EVs. The minerals are right on the edge of that, on solar panels and, barriers and so forth. So it is a precarious situation. And, our governments and others have noted it, but there's not clear that there's much you can do about it. So you are trading one form of dependence for another form of dependence. And you stand back and say, are U.S.-Chinese relations going to get better, or are they going to get worse? And I leave that question for your listeners to decide for themselves. But I think you can read the tea leaves.
And I was also curious, thinking about the same question from the perspective of the producers. As you said, there's a number of these countries. Indonesia comes to mind, in addition to the ones you cited, where they'll produce, 60, perhaps 70% of the nickel. And to one extent, this should be a massive boon to these countries. However, historically, natural resource wealth has often led, as you alluded to political instability, and it hasn't always worked out so well for the countries with the natural resource wealth. Are there any lessons that maybe some of these countries that are the big producers of the future should heed?
Well, I think, first of all, diversification is very important. It's interesting, suddenly Indonesia has a very heavy leadership position on nickel. Suddenly people are looking at the Philippines, which has not been a place that people have focused on, saying, well, there's there. But you do have the relationship between governments in these resource countries and companies. And there was an eminent economist named Ray Vernon, who was professor at Harvard, but he's also a great expert on commodities. Among other things, when he was at the M&M chocolate company, he took the lead in developing the chocolate-covered peanut. So he really studied commodity markets, and he came up with this concept called the obsolescing bargain, which is, let's say, David, you're a company and you invest $6 billion to develop a new mine, and you have a great time signing the documents, little flags on the table and a toast and everything. And then 3 years later, a populist government comes to power. And lo and behold, they say, well, we don't like the deal you made, but you say, this was greenfield. There was no history here. We took a great risk. We're willing to do it. And they said, no, we want to change the terms. And then you go into arbitration. You stop your investment. And I think that's the threat that's out there. I mean, right now, something to really keep your eye on, this effort to diversify supply chains, de-risk them. A lot of that is about building things in Mexico. But look at the outcome of the Mexican election. Is it going to continue the very nationalistic policies that, among other things, ensure that there's not an adequate electricity supply? So there's never stability. And so really part of the case has to be diversification, and it has to be on the part of the host country, realizing that they're going to benefit much more from the investment, from the GDP growth. Panama just canceled a copper concession for reasons that just became a focus of opposition, and there are many theories about it, some of them quite conspiratorial. But I forgot, either that copper project was like 5% of the country's GDP. Oh, good, you canceled it, and you just lost 5% of your GDP, and you've sent a message to investors, think twice before you invest there.
And, earlier we mentioned your book, The New Map. I wanted to bring up another book that you are, of course, extremely well known for, The Prize, which won a Pulitzer. And I wanted to ask you, if oil was the prize of the 20th century, what do you think the prize of the 21st century will be? And what lengths should we expect countries and companies to go to win it?
First, let me say, good news about the prize, turned out it never had an audiobook. And by next December, we're going to have an audiobook of it read by a very skilled narrator. So for those who haven't read the book, there will be an audiobook, which, will If you're listening while you're walking, we'll cover quite a lot of walks. People say something in the realm of AI, chips, but more broadly than that, it's the tools of AI and the control. Oil, you can kind of visualize it, but this is mastery of technology that's unfolding very quickly that can do a lot of good and can do a lot of harm. And I think it's going to, where the struggles will be. It's interesting when you think about the Ukraine war. The Spanish Civil War was like the beta testing for World War II, for technology and tactics. And, we're seeing the new face of warfare in Ukraine. And it's a combination of traditional things like shells and artillery, but it's also AI and it's information war and cyber. It's much more complex, but I think I don't know if we'd say AI, cyber, but in that realm and the power that comes with that.
That's a fascinating answer. Thinking about what is going to be the thing that dominates our life the way oil and energy did in the 20th century.
Yeah. And yet you do come back to energy because, the U.S. electric power industry has been very accustomed to flat demand or very tiny growth. And now it's suddenly all the expectations for growth and projections are shooting up, partly because of EVs, partly because of smart manufacturing and reshoring of manufacturing, and maybe most of all because of data centers and AI. Suddenly the U.S. is going to have to worry about electricity supply and making sure that you have the electricity to meet all of these needs. And that will get you back to permitting and it'll get you back to all the environmental battles and everything. So even as we march into the brave new world of AI and data, you still come back to make it all work. You still need energy.
Sure do. And we talked a little bit about, the extent to which energy is now shaping geopolitics. And in a world where we're seeing more open conflicts occurring, like the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I want to ask you, to what extent are geopolitics, in your mind, shaping the future of energy? And how do you see some of the policies that are often seen as kind of increasingly nationalistic, like CBAM in Europe and the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, in that geopolitical context?
Well, I think it is, more protectionist, more nationalistic. Up until about 2019, people really didn't think about supply chains except people who kind of operated them, and it was all about efficiency. Now they've become strategic. And, reshoring United States manufacturing. CBAM, to the Europeans, it's a way to pursue climate policies. And by the way, to also protect their manufacturing because they have paid for carbon in effect. But to developing countries, it's protectionism and it's the imposition of Europe's values on the rest of the world. But you look at US and China, we're still highly integrated, but it's getting more and more fraught. And yet the two economies are so integrated that I think there's some in Washington who just think we can just sunder the links. And then you have Secretary of Treasury Yellen who says, well, you can't really do that, but you have to, in certain areas, you have to be more protectionist and so forth. But the IRA is amazing. When I was in Japan some months ago, having dinner with some Japanese, they were sort of almost joking how the U.S., sort of joking, used to constantly criticize Japan for industrial policy. And here we have called new industrial policy or new industrial strategy, but it's industrial policy like on steroids. And they're saying, well, wait a second, you always told us not to do this. But this is, it's partly driven by climate, but it's also very much driven by the competition with China. And so I think that's a really good example of your point about how geopolitics is shaping economic decision-making.
And you talk with so many leaders and policymakers around the world. I'm curious, if you were to focus on the US and China, obviously there are competing interests, which are what they are. But do you ever get a sense that there's also some misunderstandings of each other's interests or each other's motivations that may get in the way of avenues for cooperation on some of these problems?
Yeah, I think the Chinese believe that we're trying to encircle them. And we certainly see China, particularly South China Sea, as well as Taiwan. And that's why in the paperback, of the new map, I have that whole chapter called The Four Ghosts Who Haunt the South China Sea. Because if you say, where could things really blow up? I mean, there's Taiwan, but it could also happen in the South China Sea, which something like a third of world commerce passes through it, and China claims it as its own waters. You look at history, you look at World War One and World War Two. World War One was almost in some ways an accident, and yet there was such momentum. If the driver, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, hadn't made a wrong turn, there might not have been a First World War because the assassination of the Archduke might not have happened. World War II was revanchism on the part of Germany, kind of different origins, but you have to look at that experience and say people make mistakes, people misunderstand. And sometimes, I think one of the hardest things to do is to sort out intentions. What are the intentions? And, the intentions in one part of the Chinese government may be different than the intentions in another part of the Chinese government. But obviously, the great geopolitical issue for the 21st century is the great power competition of the United States and China, and how it plays out, and that people don't make mistakes. I've been thinking about this a lot. A lot of history is just people making mistakes.
And thinking about that, when we look at a lot of the big advances globally in terms of things like electric vehicle production, solar power installation, much of it is coming in China. And I'm curious, from your conversations and analysis, how do you think the Chinese are thinking about the future of energy?
Let's take EVs. It's the world's largest automobile market, and they developed a lot of it with partnerships with Western companies. But I think they came to the conclusion that they would never be able to compete globally with internal combustion engines because they were too late. But, too late, baby. But not too late in terms of EVs. And, the third largest EV market in the world is China export of EVs. So I think they saw that this is the way that they could dominate that market, like they dominate 80% of solar panels. We talked about mineral processing. And you see Europe and the United States now very concerned about what this will do, both to their conventional automobile industries and also to their own EV. That's when, Secretary Yellen was in China, a lot of her conversation was about, protecting against overcapacity from China and protect our green supply chains. So, China's has become the workshop of the world, and they intend in these areas, they're very advanced. And they're half of the world's wind and solar is installed in China, even as they're also adding new coal-fired plants. So, and I think both Europe, the EU, and the US are saying, how do we deal with this onslaught? And we saw one way you deal with it is putting 100% tariffs on EVs from China.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Dan, for spending time with us again this morning. I've got one more question for you, though. And that is, I just wanted to ask you broadly, what else have you been thinking about the future of energy? Or, to put it more bluntly, what questions should I have been asking you?
To me, very interesting. It may sound a little wonky, but how are you going to meet this electricity demand? And how much of that is going to be met by natural gas? And how much of it is going to be met by batteries to manage the system? And what kind of modifications will result from that? We're still at the early stages of that. Obviously, the IRA is, as they say, is agnostic. The Inflation Reduction Act, molecules as well as electrons. How, we don't know how carbon capture will fully develop as a commercial business. So those are some of the questions that I'm thinking about, and do think that the picture of the energy transition that kind of came out of the pandemic thinking during COVID really needs to be rethought. Reality, I think, means the energy transition is going to be more complicated and take more time. And it will play out in different parts of the world. Going back to your questions and comments about the developing world, we'll have a different perspective. So I think when we have our next conversation, we'll have more data points to understand the energy transition is actually going to look like, not what it looks like on a graph.
Well, I'll look forward to that next conversation, and I'll look forward to getting the prize on audiobook. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for coming by, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Daniel Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global and author of the best-selling book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, as well as the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Prize. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Future of Energy. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange. Market participants need the confidence and ability to secure funding for resource development, production, processing, refining, and transportation of commodities across the globe, with markets for LNG, battery metals, and emissions offsets at the core of the transition to sustainability. Abax Exchange is building solutions to manage risk in these rapidly changing global markets, facilitating futures and options contracts designed to offer market participants clear price signals and hedging capabilities in those markets essential to our sustainable energy transition. Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.